Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Brett Smith with WebAttract, and I'm here with my co-principal, Mike Agron, and our special guest, Katie Rodriguez.
Thank you for having me on. As a student of business, I'm curious to know the role that webinars will play in the marketing mix of forward-thinking companies. Of course, the availability of different forms of media on the web now is just completely different than it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. It's happening so quickly. So to begin, could you help me understand what exactly a webinar is?
Absolutely. You want to take that one, Mike?
Sure. A webinar actually stands for a web-based seminar. And what that means is, rather than what people experience in a live seminar setting where they actually come to a conference room or a hotel ballroom to learn something, this is all done over the web, and it's done through the internet, where the internet facilitates the ability to project voices and pictures, and in some cases video, of a particular topic or subject. And that's why it's called a webinar.
All right, so how is a webinar different from a seminar in ways other than actually everyone having to go to a physical location?
Well, I'll give you a couple ideas. Number one, it's virtual. What that means is you can be any place in the world, any time zone, any geography, as long as you have a connection to the internet. And so by virtue of that, you're able to really expand your reach to get an audience that would find something of interest in whatever that topic is. So you can cut across time zones, geographies, and pull everybody together at once, and they don't have to get in their car, yet alone an airplane, and travel anywhere. They can all do it from their desktop. That's why they're called virtual meetings.
And if I might add to that, Katie, another thing that's important with a webinar is, as a substitute for the live interaction, face-to-face interaction that you have with an audience in a physical location, you have all of the data that we can capture on how we interact with them through the event.
So if the viewers of the webinar don't have to travel and they don't have to be in the same physical location as everyone else who's watching, are there any strictures or barriers or ways that this method of communication is different from an actual physical seminar?
Yes, and that's a great question. The biggest difference is, unlike a live event where you can actually see someone and pick up their body language, their facial expressions, and their behavior, in a webinar, you're virtually speaking into a large space.
Wow.
So the only connection that you really have is your voice. Your voice is your instrument. How will you use your voice to be engaging, interesting, and passionate about your subject is what's going to help engage your audience. Of course, you have to have solid content, and you have to have something of a visual nature that provides them with something to be interested in, but it's really your voice. So you do not, it's different ground rules. You don't have the ability to go into a live auditorium and ask your audience how they feel about something.
You know what? 98% of communication is nonverbal, correct? All right, so what happens if you lose 98% of the communication that you could have with an audience because you don't have anything that is nonverbal?
That's why the voice is so important. And in fact, if we're looking at different types of communication studies where the nonverbal portion is so important in connecting with an audience, your gestures, how you look, how you sound, and the content, and primarily how you're coming across with your body language is the primary force that people connect whether or not you're being credible, how you sound. In the webinar, you have to project as much passion, enthusiasm, and excitement as you can for your topic. That's the main ingredient that's going to keep your audience listening. And in fact, it's not just one voice. To the contrary, the more voices on a webinar, the better the audience hears a dialogue rather than a monologue. So it's being able to play those voices, and it's looking for the communication style. Is it two people speaking? Is it somebody interviewing somebody? Is it somebody on a panel? Those are all critical factors in helping to make sure that a webinar is engaging.
Those are very interesting points. And Brett, if I'm correct, on LinkedIn, you're quite connected as an audience recruitment professional. Am I correct?
Very much so.
So in your experience, what exactly does it take to successfully run a webinar that connects with an audience?
Well, there's two things in operation there. First is how you reach the audience that you want to attract to the event. And what's very important is that it's an audience that accurately matches the value proposition or the message that you're trying to communicate. particularly in the arena of social media, which we so fervently believe we are a centerpiece of. We have to be relevant. And to that extent, for instance, if our audience is marketing, but we want to make sure we're communicating with the right segment within it, which could be public relations, product management, corporate communications, you name it, we have to isolate that group. And then the second piece of that is the message itself. The message itself, which is first communicated through the invitations that we recruit an audience via, and then how that is translated into the presentation that's actually made on Go Live Day.
Okay, so you're expressing that webinars are a hybrid of the form of social media and the fact that their whole function is to deliver content. And as Mike stated earlier, when you have nonverbal communication methods, you have to rely on just the content. So would you say that webinars put tons more pressure on companies to have meaningful content?
Absolutely. It can't just be market speak. It has to be something valuable on its own merits.
Define valuable.
Well, it has to be information that one can bring in to their day-to-day, in our case, business operations, and be able to put to use in some useful manner. Or it has to be validating of something that they had already assumed to be the case. It has to be a way for them to indirectly interact with their peers over that content.
Understood.
Let me add to that. That's a great point, because the whole purpose of a webinar, from a demand generation perspective, is to do the most important portion of any selling experience, and that's to create two people having a dialogue, getting someone into a conversation. So today, everywhere we go, we hear join the conversation. A webinar's success is how well you've not only attracted the audience that Brett spoke about, but how well you stimulated their intellectual curiosity, so they'll walk away saying, you know what, I learned something I didn't know, or they gave me some great ideas. I want to have a conversation with them.
But why is it important to stimulate intellectual curiosity in an audience?
Because until you are heard, there's no interest in having a conversation. So today, the big challenge is getting above the noise and the clutter. If I'm just talking market speak, as Brett said, I'm going to sound like everybody else. But if I can actually give you something of value and show you something that maybe is based upon the lessons learned from a case study or a thought leader in a particular area, it just might get you interested enough to go, you know, I've been thinking about that, or I think this organization can help me. I want to talk to them. That's the real deliverable of a webinar. And when you do that and you create the opportunity to have that conversation, you start at the beginning of the sales cycle with a real opportunity for two people to get to know each other and then determine if there's business value and a reason to continue doing business.
The other element, Katie, is genuineness. I think most people realize that there's usually a commercial interest at some point, but they don't want to feel like they're being sold. And that's why the content itself has to be genuine. Now, it's not just the presentation of the content or the voices that are communicating expertise or insights. It's also the bi-directional aspect of how we communicate with webinars. It's quite different from how one would typically present in front of an audience.
You bring up a couple interesting points which I think converge. The first is that it's important to rise above the noise. I mean, the internet has made possible so many more connections and so many different methods of reaching audiences as a result, but because it is so easy to administer messages through the web, there is of course a lot of noise. So especially digital natives like myself, or people who use the web a lot, we're very, very fast at just cutting out the noise. If something doesn't engage us immediately, we're done. And I think that's translating to customers in general. So how is it necessary for a company to distinguish themselves in terms of webinars?
Well, it's just like any other communications effort. It's about setting appropriate expectations, among other things. Now, there are obviously ways that you can communicate that through subject lines and emails and discussions, postings, and social media groups and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, what's very important is that what you're putting out there is something that is in fact engaging.
Okay.
And once they arrive, and this is about setting expectations, they need to know that they become part of the dialogue. So as Mike was saying, starting the conversation, that's really what we're doing. A conversation is a dialogue. And so the elements of a webinar, using chat, using a Twitter feed, using exit surveys and polls and so on, these are ways for folks to contribute, to actually bring their own personal thought leadership into this and to be heard in a way that they wouldn't typically be heard in a physical meeting.
Okay, so if, pardon me, just to say something, if customers or clients or people who are engaging with your brand are actually communicating via the webinar, would that indicate a higher level of interest in the brand or service that the company's offering?
Absolutely. The entire exercise is extremely self-qualifying. If you're just looking at it from a sales perspective, the nuts and bolts of it are, once we recruit them via an invitation, they arrive at a registration page where they share just a modicum of information about themselves, some contact data, and one of Mike's favorite questions, what is it that you expect to get from this webinar?
Okay, pause for a second. We're going from the original mode of marketing, which is to exploitatively look for information from people who may not have any idea who you are. And now we're going to a forum that will allow customers to submit their own information voluntarily because they feel that they have something to gain from it.
Exactly.
So how does this translate into webinars being able to measure ROI in a different way than previous marketing methods?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways that Brett and I have learned from doing this, but let me back up for a second. You asked a question earlier about what's the difference or what are some of the differences between a webinar and a live event. Mm-hmm. In a live event, if you're sitting in the audience and you found that the subject wasn't engaging, you might look around and figure it's a little uncomfortable to get up and walk out. But the beauty of a webinar is it's your anonymity. If you don't like what's coming across and we're not giving you solid information that you can use, click, you'll bail. So it becomes absolutely incumbent to give information. Now with that information, and as Brett has mentioned, we believe a lot of content that is highly valuable that talks about the what, the why, and maybe a little bit of the how is what gets people interested. So by doing that, we're able to get them into a conversation and accelerate the ability to qualify if there's a reason to do business. And Brett, I think you've got some statistics. If we take a look at from the base of registration to what we're able to convert into actual conversations and into actual deals. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and give Katie that insight?
Of course, and that goes directly as an answer to your question about ROI. Mm-hmm. So yes, it starts with the dialogue. The dialogue implies we're both sharing information.
The customer and the company.
Exactly. Okay. So we've shared our information by the invitation and by the live presentation that we're delivering. Mm-hmm. The attendee or the registrant first shares a little information on the registration page, and then, as I mentioned before, there are lots of ways during the event that they can express their point of view. Mm-hmm. Every single one of those points of view are captured by the webinar platform. So first and foremost, you have market research, not necessarily a statistically relevant example when you're talking hundreds instead of millions, but for the particular client underwriting the event, this is platinum information. The second piece is when all of that is provided as intelligence to the client after the event, they can then extend the dialogue beyond the webinar to something that gets closer to a sales engagement. So what I mean by that, just a brick and mortar analogy, if you'll permit me. Mm-hmm. If you think about a typical sales call that you might receive yourself, the person usually introduces themselves, mm-hmm. and they usually cut rather quickly to what it is they're selling. Alternatively, someone that attended a webinar, we can call and introduce ourselves, but rather than jumping directly into a sales pitch, which is essentially a cold call exercise, we can say, you know, Katie, you asked this question during the event, and I know the answer that you received was this. Do you feel like that answered your question adequately, or could I expand on that a little bit more for you?
And you have the prerogative of jumping right into that because you've already established a relationship with that particular customer, an individual relationship nonetheless.
And I think there's an example. We just did a webinar a few weeks ago for an organization that uses mobile technology to help people become more effective in their mobile workforce management. Now, because that they registered for the webinar and they attended, we always conduct a couple of what we call online polls. We ask their opinion, and we ask their opinion on a particular subject. We collect their votes, we share their votes, and we show the audience where people fit. But here's what was really interesting. This organization marketed a particular piece of hardware that was somewhat of a smartphone. And we asked the question, which of the following smartphones do you use? Apple, Android, Windows. We don't use smartphones. 57% of the audience said they don't use smartphones.
Wow.
So they gave that information
And
up.
you don't even have to go looking for that.
No.
Okay, so you're telling me that webinars are a form of communicating with the audience and engaging them with your brand that costs nothing in terms of travel, brings everyone together, brings qualified customers to your brand who volunteer their own information, therefore building your qualified lists of customers, and also allows you the ability to track more specific bits of data than ever before. So if webinars are that effective at marketing in general, why can't I just go use like a electronic meeting software and make my own webinar?
Well, you could if you don't care about the outcomes. If you're interested in really being able to reach an audience beyond your normal audience, you need to be able to identify who that audience is. You need to be able to have access to that audience. You need to be able to identify what the relevant message or value proposition is. You need someone who is, as we call Brett, a master audience recruiter, to figure out how do we get that audience, how do we create an invitation that's compelling, that's going to make them want to come and register. And then once we get them to register, how do we get that information without seeming invasive or manipulative? And how do we keep the process moving? And then more importantly, once we have that, how do we coach the speakers or the presenters on making sure that what they deliver is consistent with what the invitation said, they're passionate about it, and that the audience walks away with something they didn't have before?
All right, so it sounds like there are very many benefits to doing a webinar correctly, and it's a huge gain for a company that knows how to manage them. So I'm curious, what are the risks of doing it wrong?
Well, the risks of doing it wrong are exactly the same in any other marketing activity. You know, the entire idea is to secure more brand equity and to create demand. But inversely, if executed poorly, you can accomplish exactly the opposite. So, for instance, if one does not set appropriate expectations and you deliver something that's more like a sales pitch than a delivery of informational content, you may alienate the audience that you identified and spent so much time and effort recruiting, they won't return again. And that's an important point because a webinar by itself isn't a marketing strategy. A series of webinars, however, are. And the whole idea is to not just extend the dialogue after the event itself, but to continue to engage over content over time.
And actually, my mother taught me, how many first impressions do you get to make?
I think about one.
Yeah. And if you go out and you spend all this time and effort and energy and resources on recruiting an audience and you fail to deliver what they wanted, click, you lost them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. You've answered all of my questions fabulously, and I really appreciate this introduction to webinars, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you for inviting us to be part of the conversation, too.
My pleasure.
Thanks again.